On a freezing night in February 1959, 9 experienced hikers ran out of their tent into the darkness of the Ural Mountains. They weren't wearing boots. Some of them weren't even wearing coats. The tent had been cut open from the inside. When rescuers finally found their bodies weeks later, the scene made even veteran investigators uneasy. Some hikers died from freezing temperatures. Others had crushed ribs and fractured skulls. One victim was missing her tongue. And even today, no one can fully explain what happened on the slopes of Dyatlov Pass. The wind roared across the frozen mountain like a living thing. Snow whipped violently across the slope, erasing footprints and swallowing sound. Somewhere in that darkness, 9 young hikers were running for their lives. They ran barefoot across ice and rock. They ran without jackets. They ran into a Siberian night where temperatures could drop below -30 degrees Celsius. Behind them, their tent flapped violently in the wind. Its fabric had been slashed open from the inside. Inside the tent were their boots, their coats, their food, their maps, everything they needed to survive. But whatever terrified them was so immediate, so overwhelming, that they chose to flee into the freezing wilderness rather than stay inside. By morning, every one of them would be dead. And the mystery of why they ran would become one of the strangest cases in modern history. The wind howled across the frozen slopes of the Ural Mountains as searchers pushed through waist-deep snow. For weeks they had been looking for 9 missing hikers. 9 experienced young adventurers who had set out on a winter expedition. 9 people who should have returned home days ago. Then one of the rescuers suddenly stopped. Half buried in the snow ahead of them was a tent. But something was wrong. The fabric had been ripped open. Not from the outside, from the inside. Whoever had been inside that tent had slashed their way out and fled into the freezing darkness, without boots, without coats, without any chance of surviving the brutal Siberian winter. The rescuers looked around the empty mountainside. There were footprints leading away from the tent, barefoot footprints, and what they were about to find next would become one of the most disturbing mysteries in modern history. Because every single one of those 9 hikers was dead. Some were frozen, some had catastrophic internal injuries. One was missing her tongue, and to this day, nobody knows what really happened on that mountain. January 1959. Deep within the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, winter ruled with brutal authority. Temperatures regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. The wind swept across endless white ridges, turning the landscape into a frozen desert of ice and snow. It was the kind of environment where a single mistake could kill you, but for experienced hikers and explorers, the harsh wilderness was also a place of challenge and adventure. That winter, a group of young Soviet students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute planned a long skiing expedition through this remote region. Their destination was a mountain known as Otorten. The name in the local Mansi language roughly translated to something unsettling. Don't go there. To the students, the warning sounded more like folklore than a real threat. They were skilled hikers, many with years of experience navigating harsh winter terrain. Their leader was a confident 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. Friends described him as disciplined, intelligent, and quietly determined. He had organized several previous expeditions and knew how to lead a team through dangerous conditions. The group consisted of 9 hikers in total. 8 men and 2 women originally set out on the journey. But one member, Yuri Yudin, would turn back early after developing severe joint pain. That decision would save his life. The remaining 9 hikers continued toward the mountains. Their team included Zinaida Kolmogorova, a cheerful and energetic student who loved outdoor adventure. Rustem Slobodin, an athletic engineering student known for his endurance. Lyudmila Dubinina, a determined young woman with a reputation for stubborn courage. Alexander Kolevatov, a quiet physics student fascinated by technology and science. Yuri Krivonishenko, a lively personality who often lifted the group's spirits with jokes. Georgy Doroshenko, strong and confident, someone friends trusted in difficult situations. Nikolai Thibobrignol, thoughtful and intelligent, with a passion for engineering. Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest member of the group, a decorated World War II veteran. And of course their leader, Igor Dyatlov. Together they formed a close team of young explorers driven by curiosity and adventure. They documented their journey carefully, photographs, diary entries. small notes about weather conditions and daily progress. In those early days, the expedition looked almost joyful. The hikers laughed, joked, and skied across the snowy wilderness. Their pictures show smiling faces, playful snowball fights, and moments of camaraderie around campfires. It looked like the beginning of an unforgettable adventure. But as the group pushed deeper into the mountains, conditions began to change. The weather grew harsher, the wind became stronger. Snowstorms reduced visibility to almost nothing. Still, the hikers pressed forward. They were aiming to reach Otorten and complete the difficult route required for a prestigious Soviet hiking certification. It was a challenge they were determined to conquer. On February 1st, the group began ascending the eastern slope of a mountain known as Kholat Syakhl. In the language of the local Mansi people, its name carried a dark meaning. Dead Mountain. The weather that day was brutal. Strong winds blasted across the exposed slope. Snow whipped through the air, making navigation extremely difficult. According to later analysis of their diaries and photographs, the hikers likely realized they had drifted slightly off course. Instead of descending into the shelter of a nearby forest valley, they made a surprising decision. They set up camp directly on the open mountainside. It was not the ideal place for a campsite. The slope was exposed to the wind, the temperature was plummeting. But perhaps they believed they could correct their route in the morning. So they pitched their large canvas tent against the snow. They secured it carefully using skis and poles. Inside, the group prepared for the night. They removed their heavy boots and outer clothing. They likely shared food, wrote final notes in their journals, and prepared to sleep. Outside, the wind continued to roar across the mountain. The temperature dropped further into deadly territory. Then something happened. Something so terrifying that every person inside that tent made the same desperate decision. They cut their way out, not through the entrance, through the walls, and they ran. When the hikers failed to send their expected telegram announcing their return, concerns slowly began to grow. At first, friends and family assumed the group had simply been delayed. Winter expeditions often faced unexpected obstacles. But as days passed without contact, worrying turned into alarm. By late February, search teams were finally organized. Volunteers, students, and rescue workers began combing the remote mountain region. Planes flew overhead scanning the snow-covered slopes. Days passed with no sign of the missing hikers. Then on February 26th, the searchers spotted something unusual on the side of Kholat Syakhl. A dark shape against the endless white snow. It was the tent. When the rescuers reached it, they immediately sensed something was wrong. The tent was partially collapsed and buried under snow. The entrance flap was still secured, but the canvas walls had been cut open from the inside. Inside the tent they found nearly everything the hikers owned: boots, warm coats, food supplies, cameras, personal belongings. All left behind, but the hikers themselves were gone. Investigators carefully examined the snow around the campsite. What they found made the situation even stranger. A series of footprints led away from the tent. 9 sets, some barefoot, some wearing only socks. A few wearing a single boot. The prints suggested the hikers had not been running chaotically. Instead, they seemed to be walking in a relatively calm line down the slope toward a forest about 1.5 kilometers away. It was as if they had deliberately left the tent. But why would anyone calmly walk into a lethal snowstorm without proper clothing? The searchers followed the footprints into the forest. At the edge of the trees they made their first grim discovery. Under a large cedar tree they found the bodies of 2 hikers, Yuri Krivonishenko and Georgy Doroshenko. They were lying near the remains of a small fire. Both were barefoot. Both were dressed only in thin underwear. Their skin was frozen solid. The branches of the cedar tree above them were broken several meters high, as if someone had climbed it desperately trying to see something in the distance. Investigators noticed something else disturbing. The 2 men had severe burns on their hands, as if they had tried to warm themselves too close to the fire, or perhaps held onto the flames in desperation. Not far from the cedar tree, searchers discovered 3 more bodies: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustem Slobodin. They were scattered along a line between the forest and the tent. It looked as though they had been trying to return to the campsite. But the cold had killed them before they could make it. Rustem Slobodin had a fractured skull, yet strangely, the injury did not appear severe enough to be fatal. The official cause of death for the first 5 victims was listed as hypothermia. But 4 hikers were still missing. Weeks passed before search teams finally discovered them. Their bodies were buried deep under snow in a ravine within the forest. What investigators found there would transform the case from a tragic accident into a chilling mystery, because these 4 victims had injuries that made absolutely no sense. Lyudmila Dubinina had massive chest trauma. Several ribs were shattered with the force of a powerful impact. Yet there were almost no external wounds. Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignol had a severe skull fracture. Semyon Zolotaryov also suffered crushing chest injuries. Alexander Kolevatov had a broken neck. But the most disturbing detail was found on Lyudmila Dubinina. Her tongue was missing, so were parts of her lips and facial tissue. Investigators stared at the bodies in disbelief. These injuries looked more like the aftermath of a violent collision than exposure to cold. One Soviet investigator later described the force involved as comparable to a car crash. But there were no cars, no roads, no signs of a struggle, just snow, endless frozen wilderness, and 9 dead hikers. As the investigation continued, the mystery only deepened. Some clothing recovered from the bodies tested positive for unusual levels of radiation. The final report eventually concluded with a vague explanation. The hikers had died because of what officials described as a compelling natural force. No further details were given. The case was quietly closed, but the questions never disappeared. What could have forced 9 experienced hikers to abandon their tent in the middle of a lethal snowstorm? What caused the catastrophic injuries found on the final 4 victims? Why were some bodies missing parts of their faces? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what exactly happened on Dead Mountain that night? The wind-over Kholat cycle never really stops. Even today, decades after the tragedy, it moves across the mountain like a restless force. The snow shifts constantly, erasing footprints, swallowing evidence, and burying the past beneath layers of silence. But in the winter of 1959, Soviet investigators were standing in that silence trying to understand something that made no sense. 9 experienced hikers had abandoned a warm tent in the middle of a deadly storm. 5 had frozen to death in the open. 4 had suffered injuries so violent that investigators compared them to the force of a car crash, and yet there were no signs of a fight. No evidence of another person, no clear explanation. At first, the investigation followed the most logical path. Maybe the hikers had panicked. Maybe a sudden avalanche had threatened the tent, forcing them to flee. Avalanches in the mountains could strike without warning. A mass of snow sliding down the slope could easily crush a tent and kill everyone inside. But almost immediately, that theory began to fall apart. The slope where the tent had been pitched was relatively shallow, not steep enough to produce a large avalanche. Even more puzzling, the tent itself was still standing when rescuers found it. Partially collapsed under snow, yes, but not buried beneath tons of debris. If an avalanche had occurred, the tent should have been completely destroyed. There were also the footprints. Searchers had followed the trail leading away from the tent for hundreds of meters. The prints were clear, orderly, and calm. 9 individuals walking down the mountain together. Not running, not scattering in panic, just walking. That behavior didn't match the chaos of an avalanche escape. Then investigators considered another possibility. Perhaps the hikers had been attacked. The region was home to the indigenous Mansi people, a small community that had lived in the Ural Mountains for generations. Early investigators briefly wondered if the hikers had wandered into sacred territory. Maybe they had angered the locals. Maybe someone had driven them away from the campsite. But that theory also collapsed quickly. The Mansi were known to be peaceful, and there were no signs of violence at the campsite. No unfamiliar footprints, no weapons, no evidence of a struggle. The hikers' injuries also didn't resemble an attack. The massive chest trauma suffered by Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov looked more like the result of extreme pressure. Bones crushed inward, organs severely damaged. Yet their skin showed very little external injury. One forensic specialist would later say the force required to cause those injuries was comparable to the impact of a high-speed vehicle. But there were no vehicles anywhere near that mountain. As investigators continued searching the area, they began noticing other details that felt strange. Several pieces of clothing recovered from the hikers contained traces of radiation. Not extreme levels, but measurable enough to raise questions. At first this discovery seemed minor. But when the information leaked to the public, rumors exploded. Why would hikers in a remote mountain region be carrying radioactive contamination? Some investigators quietly wondered whether the hikers had stumbled onto something they were never supposed to see. The late 1950s were the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was conducting secret military experiments across vast regions of its territory. Missile tests, experimental aircraft, even early nuclear technologies. If the hikers had accidentally witnessed a classified weapons test, it was possible that authorities might try to hide the evidence. Adding to the mystery were reports from other hikers and villagers in the region. Several people claimed to have seen glowing orange spheres moving through the night sky around the same time the Dyatlov group disappeared. Strange lights drifting silently over the mountains. Some witnesses described them as fiery balls floating across the horizon. Others said they looked like rockets. If military experiments were happening nearby, those lights might have been missiles or aerial tests. But no official explanation was ever confirmed. As the investigation continued, the details grew even more disturbing. When Lyudmila Dubinina's body was examined, investigators confirmed that her tongue was missing. So were parts of her lips and soft tissue around the face. To modern viewers, this detail sounds horrifying. But forensic experts later suggested a possible explanation. Her body had been buried under snow in a small stream within the ravine. Over time, natural decomposition and scavenging animals may have removed the softer tissues. Still, in the context of the larger mystery, the detail fueled endless speculation. Even stranger were the hikers' clothing arrangements. Some of the victims in the ravine were wearing pieces of clothing that belonged to the hikers who had died earlier near the cedar tree. It appeared that after the first two victims froze to death, the remaining survivors had removed their clothes in a desperate attempt to stay warm. That meant something terrifying. At least some of the group had survived long enough to realize their friends were dying. And in that frozen forest, they had made the brutal decision to take the clothing from their bodies. The final four hikers seemed to have tried building some kind of shelter in the ravine. Branches had been arranged over the snow. It looked like the beginnings of a survival structure. Perhaps they believed they could wait out the storm. But whatever happened next had ended their lives with enormous force. For decades, theories about the Dyatlov Pass incident continued to multiply. Some people believed the hikers had encountered a secret Soviet weapon. Others suggested they had witnessed a military parachute mine test. Parachute mines were explosive devices that detonated above the ground, producing massive shockwaves capable of crushing internal organs without leaving many external injuries. That theory would explain the severe chest trauma suffered by several victims. But again, there was no definitive evidence. Another idea involved a rare natural phenomenon called infrasound. Strong winds blowing across certain mountain shapes can create powerful low-frequency sound waves. Humans cannot consciously hear infrasound, but it can affect the brain. In extreme cases it may trigger panic, anxiety, or a powerful sense of dread. Some scientists suggested the wind around Koletsyakul might have generated infrasound vibrations that caused the hikers to panic suddenly and flee the tent. If they had run outside in a confused state, they might have become disoriented and unable to return. But this theory also struggled to explain the severe injuries. Years passed, then decades. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed, and many old government archives were open to researchers. Yet even with new access to historical records, no clear answer emerged. In 2019, Russian authorities officially reopened the Dyatlov Pass investigation. Modern scientists began analyzing the evidence again using advanced computer simulations and forensic techniques. One team studied the mountain slope and snow conditions in detail. They created models showing how a small slab avalanche could have formed above the tent. Unlike a massive avalanche, a slab avalanche occurs when a solid layer of snow breaks loose and slides downward. Even a relatively small slide could produce tremendous pressure. According to this modern analysis, a delayed slab avalanche might have struck the tent hours after it was pitched. The impact could have partially collapsed the structure and terrified the hikers. In panic, they cut their way out of the tent and escaped into the storm. Some of them may have been injured immediately, others fled downhill toward the forest. The first two victims attempted to build a fire beneath the cedar tree. 3 others tried returning to the tent but froze during the attempt. The remaining 4 sought shelter in the ravine. Later, a secondary collapse of heavy snow could have crushed them, causing the severe internal injuries. The theory seemed plausible, it explained many details. But even today, not everyone is convinced. Critics argue that the evidence for an avalanche remains weak. The slope was still relatively shallow, the tent showed limited structural damage, and the footprints suggested the hikers moved calmly rather than fleeing in panic. Some researchers continue to believe that something else occurred on that mountain, something that has never been fully revealed. For the families of the victims, the uncertainty has lasted a lifetime. Yuri Yudin, the one hiker who turned back early because of illness, spent decades trying to understand why his friends died. He often said that decision haunted him for the rest of his life. In interviews years later, he admitted something painful. Sometimes he wished he had stayed with them, not because he wanted to die, but because he wanted to know the truth. All 9 hikers were eventually buried in their hometowns. Their funerals drew large crowds. Friends and classmates struggled to comprehend how a simple hiking expedition had turned into a national mystery. Even today, the Dyatlov Pass incident continues to fascinate investigators, historians, and storytellers. Dozens of documentaries have been made. Scientists continue analyzing the evidence. New theories appear every year, but the mountain remains silent. The wind still moves across the same frozen slopes where 9 young explorers once set up their final camp. Somewhere beneath that snow, the truth of what happened that night may still be hidden. And perhaps the most chilling part of the Dyatlov Pass mystery is this: 9 intelligent, experienced hikers faced something on that mountain that convinced them their safest place was not inside their tent, but out in the deadly cold. Running into the darkness. Powerful closing line. Whatever happened on Dead Mountain that night was terrifying enough to make 9 people choose the freezing wilderness over the safety of their own shelter. And that secret may still be buried beneath the snow.